Welcome to our latest tech law video series, and we're taking a little bit of a dive into one of the key areas that focuses very strongly in our 2024 Tech Index report. It's all things ESG. So I'm delighted to be joined by Natasha, Nicola and Nick. Thank you for joining us to have a little bit of a conversation here about some of the findings and what we're seeing. One of the main things that jumped out for me, Natasha, if I come to you, if you don't mind first, was looking at the geopolitical situation, looking at access to funds and so on and so forth. I had anticipated that ESG might have been taking a bit of a back seat, but it seems the results are showing the opposite. Is that in line with what you're seeing in the market?
Absolutely. It's definitely not going anywhere. It's not a flash in the pan. It is central to most businesses now, their corporate strategy. Their clients are demanding it. Whatever businesses are clients or sectors they're in, whether it's people they're selling to, their clients, the goods, the products, the services, all of the value chain require it and demand it. Their people require and demand it. They expect their businesses to be sustainable, and actually they need to be sustainable to attract the right talent. It improves their brand value. It makes them more profitable. It's not going anywhere, so it's not a surprise, Mark.
And guys, does that echo with what you're seeing?
100%, particularly the EU, which for a while now and still is sort of seen as leading the charge. Right. I think, to be honest, I agree entirely with Natasha. I think we're on only at the beginning of the ESG journey. Everyone's focused now on mandatory sustainability reporting, but we've got, there's a lot more to come, including ESG related litigation and class action litigation. And unlike the US, where various laws are being proposed or under development, in the EU we have a whole suite of laws that are concluded, in force, binding and starting to take effect now and in the years ahead.
And I think it's not just the economic uncertainty and the political environment. We've all been very focused as well on the boom in AI, and that has, been a real source of excitement in the tech sector especially. But so you might be forgiven in that context for thinking that ESG has fallen down that priority list. But as Nick and Natasha have explained, that's absolutely not the case. And particularly with the new regulatory requirements, we're seeing a lot of requests from clients coming through because they really want to understand those compliance obligations and understand what they need to put in place going forward.
So let's have a look at that. Thank you. That's interesting. So onwards and upwards, but Nick, you mentioned there that we're sort of at the start of a takeoff. So let's keep thinking about that in the context of technology, but also the rules of the game, the regulatory environment, right? Nick, maybe if I come to you, we asked our respondents in the index about how they feel about the regulatory environment generally in the tech sector, specifically here. And again, the response was surprisingly positive. Does that ring true for what you're seeing in the ESG sense?
Positive in the sense of seeing the emerging ES law and
knowing
policy
what the rules
as
are is it the case that knowing what the rules are allows you then to just get on with business because you know where the parameters are?
I mean, in some ways that finding surprises me a little, because what I hear and what we're seeing from separate research that we've conducted in a different context is that many businesses are feeling really quite overwhelmed. I mean, I think we're all familiar with being asked, please help with horizon scanning. Yeah. There's so much coming down the pipe, especially in the EU, but globally, actually, this is not confined to the EU. I think a lot of businesses are struggling just to sort of spin the plates and deal with the here and now. So I think a lot of ESG strategy, by necessity, because there's so much and there's limited time and resource, is quite short-termist. Yeah. And actually, where I think companies are struggling is to find the bandwidth and the resource to think about this as a longer term strategy. Coming back to the fact that it's not going away, they need to be doing that, and I think that's challenging.
When we were talking about AI on another episode of this, we coined the phrase the compliance opportunity, which might sound a little bit sort of an oxymoron, but the fact of getting ahead of the wave rather than remediating. Is that something that echoes in the ESG environment?
Yeah, forgive me for hogging the mic.
No, it's regulatory, so go ahead.
I mean, look, I think it's certainly right that there are, and it sounds a cliche, but there are risks and opportunities with any major regulatory shake-up. It has the potential to have a distortive effect. So those who embrace it, those who get on top of it early, are more resilient to it, less likely to suffer, and may gain a competitive advantage from it.
Yeah, and isn't it the case that we're seeing the EU lead in relation to that as well? So businesses that are more focused, that are global businesses but have a big footprint in Europe, once they get their heads around and they comply and put the systems in place in Europe, that means they're, from a global perspective, they're a head start as well, because our standards are likely to be followed, or maybe not as...
We're seeing, absolutely, we're seeing that. So for example, with the rollout of the ISSB standards, which is a climate reporting framework that's intended to harmonise standards around the globe. We're seeing countries in LATAM, in Asia Pac, now adopting ISSB, but also in their implementing laws, cherry picking the bits they think are the best from the European legislation, which is really quite interesting.
And how does that implementation go, Nicola? Just thinking about the sort of work you and I do, contractualising deals. That there's obviously the compliance piece within an organisation so you have risk managed. Then there's the supply chain and interrelationships with suppliers and customers. Is that now promulgating into actual wording and drafting in contracts?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, Mark. We are starting to see that filter into our contracting world, thinking particularly about the sourcing arrangements and outsourcing contracts. You're talking about big, often global deals there with large value chains. So yes, customer clients in particular are looking for ways in which they can implement and embed that within their contracts, and thinking about how they manage their supply chain. So thinking about governance, audit rights, reporting requirements to help them in meeting some of these new regulatory requirements.
And Nicola makes a really important point about value chain, supply chain. These laws, there are certain companies that are in scope and are bound by them directly, but then they in turn, as Nicola said, trickle down these requirements, cascade them down through the value chain. And so even if you're not actually in scope of a particular, you're going to feel it through the requirements imposed upon you or requests made of you by your direct and indirect counterparties.
So let's take one of those regulations by way of example, CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and how that might find its way into contracts and so forth. But that has a lot to do with reporting and transparency. To what extent are you seeing, because our report talks about this, the sort of the accusation of greenwashing, but also conversely, organisations potentially green hushing, underreporting. Is that a thing? It comes up in our report.
Absolutely, green hushing is a thing. First thing to remember is these reports are public and they're annual. And the detail that needs to go into them is really quite prescriptive. They will be scrutinised, not just by investors, but by other stakeholders, some of whom may be antagonists. So it's going to be extremely difficult to successfully greenwash in these reports without exposing yourself to regulatory liability and censure, reputational damage. And you're right that on the broader stage, companies are increasingly becoming concerned about the fear of greenwashing and being held to account for what they say about ESG issues, and some, not all by any stretch, but some are sort of retreating into their shells and saying less, and that's what green hushing is about. But that is not a long-term strategy either, because we've all discussed and agreed the fact that ESG issues are here and here to stay. It's a new way of doing business, it's a new way of thinking, it's a new way of companies operating in the market. You will not be able to get away with just not addressing these issues.
Okay, so let's, taking what we've discussed so far, let's bring in a more of a technology lens. Nicola, you mentioned AI a moment ago. Let's think about that, because AI, no conversation is complete these days without talking about AI. Of course, it's illegal otherwise.
You love it, don't you?
Absolutely. But the role of technology itself, a double-edged sword, right? Because the increased usage since generative AI came out, and obviously the increased footprint that creates. But at the same time, perhaps AI and technology has the way to see us out of the bind. So it is a double-edged sword. It's a competing pressure for organisations. I wonder what you think about that. How should companies balance those pressures? Nicola, do you have a view on that?
I do, yes. Especially as a technology lawyer, Mark, you'll agree, as my fellow technology lawyer colleague, that intersection of technology and meeting sustainability requirements, ESG concerns, that's a really interesting one. And I think it's very complex, but there are certainly ways that technology can be used for the greater good. So, and the way that organisations can use technology to further the sustainability agenda. So, I mean, I'm thinking of investing in using renewable energy, investing in energy efficient technologies such as advanced cooling technologies. So I think there's lots of ways, and particularly with AI as well, and the use of smart technology and AI to monitor energy usage, to optimise it, and ultimately to reduce power consumption. I think there's a lot of ways that technology can be used to further this agenda. And interestingly, the EU, as part of its digital decade, sustainability is one of the key themes that runs throughout that, and there are a lot of initiatives around that. So I think there's a big opportunity for technology and the use to further that agenda.
And Natasha, do you see that in your daily work, looking at the power deals you get involved in?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Nicola with everything she said. And, you know, also, I suppose, before we get onto the power deals, you've also got the use of AI now coming through probably in reporting requirements and the myriad of standards. You can absolutely see people developing these tools that will be helpful in the future. I see a slightly different perspective also, which is tech is driving big consumption demand. If I look at, you know, so we do corporate power purchase agreements, which is when corporates directly buy green power from new renewable energy sources. Therefore, if they weren't buying it, that renewable energy source would never have been created. Therefore, you're bringing additional renewable energy onto the grid. So DLA has entered into a corporate PPA. The tech giants are the most active globally in corporate power purchase agreements. So that does need to be congratulated. They're bringing on so much more solar and wind globally. That's really, really fantastic. But the converse is they're one of the biggest power consumers, and AI's landed. We've got all these different AI tools, and suddenly the demand is increasing, and we've got all these areas where they're rushing in and data centers need to be created. So yes, they do need to buy green energy, because if we're increasing the use of power, then we need to be making sure that we're increasing the build out of renewable energy.
And is that, you mentioned the tech giants, are they in a league of their own here? I'm looking at the report, and we talked to 1,200 organisations around the world, and they are small, medium and large, but they're technology companies, companies powered by tech. And more than half of them say ESG is absolutely a priority, but actually more than 3/4 don't have an ESG framework in place. Is that just a lag? Are they lagging behind the tech giants and others? Is that what we're
I
seeing?
would definitely say that. I think the tech giants know exactly what they're doing for ESG and sustainability, and they have all the policies in place, and all their supply chain follow those policies. Otherwise you wouldn't do transactions with them. So I'm not sure actually, Nicola, what your view is of why there is a lag with all the rest of the tech companies.
I think it goes a little bit to what Nick was saying at the outset, is that, you know, this is a big agenda. There is a lot to do, and there's various competing pressures, especially with what we've seen in the market over the last couple of years. And I think companies and organisations are struggling with resource and frankly where to start and how to make meaningful changes and embed sustainability throughout their organisation and their strategy.
And let's not forget, it's a pretty recent phenomena. I mean, the laws that are starting to bite now around mandatory sustainability reporting in the EU are only biting for some companies, the largest, mainly listed companies right now, and for other larger companies next year and beyond. And those companies, it's not long since they were going through the turmoil of COVID and lockdown, and you know, they're still recovering from that. I hesitate to even call it a lag, really. It's just getting going. Okay.
So look, our report, let's pivot to maybe two more aspects. Our report looks at the health of the tech sector generally. And the tech sector is business. Generally, everyone's powered by tech. So it's looking at the adequacy, suitability of the regulatory regime, IP, access to talent, access to funds for acquisitions, whatever it may be. Let's just think a little bit about IP and regimes generally, whether it's regulatory or IP in particular. We're seeing calls for broad access to environmentally friendly IP, the sharing of knowledge for the greater good as a way of sort of innovating for the greater good. Is that something that's coming through? That's in the report, but I wonder if you're seeing that in day-to-day life.
I am. I can think of one particular example which might surprise some people, but it's in the area of biodiversity. It's a big bone of contention between the developed and the developing world and small island nations, for example, under the auspices of the separate COP on biodiversity. Technology has a huge role to play in monitoring impacts on biodiversity and seeking to mitigate those impacts, and it's expensive, and so the developing world is asking for funding, but also for the sharing of technology to help with that. In that specific scenario, it's a really big issue.
Okay, so just one final piece. I wonder if there's anything in particular from the report you wanted to draw out, and or as we look forward, as you said earlier, Nick, that we're essentially at the foothills here of a road of regulation and new corporate ways of working. Where do you, perhaps all of you, see the next significant developments coming from?
Well, I think the point that we said at the start of it, it's not going anywhere. If you're going to be a successful, long-lasting business, you're going to have to be sustainable. You're going to have to embrace what's coming, and you're going to have to. They will have to invest. They will have to put systems and procedures and recruit people to deal with this as well. So it's not going anywhere. There, as Nick said, there's loads of regulation coming down the way. So it's just more of the same, but the smaller companies, as you said, the tech giants already have a handle on it. It's the other 3/4 of tech companies that you outlined in your report. It's their turn now.
Thank you.
Well, I'm excited about the opportunity that I think there is for the tech sector and how it can step up to help meet these priorities and lead us in a path to the use of more sustainable technology and a greener future. So I'm really excited to see the new innovations that were coming, particularly through AI, as you've said, in terms of the use of AI to monitor our changing environment and our use of energy. So as a technology lawyer, that's what I'm looking forward to and feeling positive.
Thank you.
I share the optimism. I think that companies who embrace the issues that we've been talking about have a real opportunity to gain market share and positions and make themselves more resilient against climate change and other impacts. I think there will be unintended consequences. We're already starting to see offshoring and restructuring to try and avoid these laws, which I think is ultimately a fool's errand because it's going to become global, but it is having a distortive effect. It may encourage some companies to move away from certain suppliers, which could have a really devastating effect on those companies and the local employees. I think litigation related to ESG issues is a next big wave, because all of this reporting that we've been talking about is going to root out issues and raise awareness. And it's bound to lead to more disputes, more claims, more complaints.
Is that why you're optimistic then? More work?
I started with the optimistic bit.
We should end on an optimistic note, shouldn't we? Thank you very much, Natasha, Nicola, Nick. These three experts gives you a hint of what you'll find in the Tech Index report, analysed in greater detail by more colleagues from around the world. So we commend the Tech Index 2024 to you. Thanks, guys.